Professor of Community and Environmental Sociology in the School of Forest Fisheries and Geomatic Sciences. We recently changed our name to something very long and hard to say. And I'm also appointed to the School of Natural Resources and Environment, which, if you're a graduate student in this seminar, you all are in as well. And so very briefly, this project that I'm going to be talking about today touches on some of my research interests. And so generally speaking, my research tends to focus on issues of environmental risk, environmental health and illness, environmental justice. I often focus on grassroots community organizing, so people who become activists at the local level, and just broadly environmental and social change and how those things are interrelated. If you're interested in any of those things or anything that we are talking about today during this presentation, I'm more than happy to chat. I do teach a couple of other classes, one at the undergraduate level and two others at the graduate level. So if you're interested in, like I said, these topics, or interested in taking a class that explores these things a little bit more in depth, please let me know. So I want to start by asking a question, and you can either answer in the chat or you can answer by using your mic in the room. Who can give me an example of a chemical warfare agent or a description of just sort of what those are? Anybody have like an example that comes to mind when you think about the term chemical weapons?
Like mustard gas?
Perfect. Yes, that's a great example. So mustard gas is a great example of chemical warfare. And so essentially chemical warfare agents fall into different categories. So we have harassing agents, which are meant to basically bother people, make them feel sick, but they're not intended to, have physical injury results or kill them. So that would be tear agents like tear gas, things that make you vomit, things that smell really bad, malodorants. There's incapacitating agents that make it very difficult to act in a defensive or offensive way. So one example of that would be hallucinogenics, such as LSD. And then there are lethal agents. So that example of mustard gas, that's a great example. Nerve agents, G-series lethal agents such as sarin gas, if you've heard of that, and VX or venomous agent X. Those are the types of chemical weapons that we're going to be talking about today, are the lethal ones. We actually have a pretty diverse history of chemical weapons manufacture and use in the United States. And so most people don't know this. And I actually didn't, I was sort of like vaguely aware that this used to be a thing in the United States, but I didn't really, know too much about it until I really got into this about 3 years ago. So the US has produced chemical weapons, which are, like I said, they're designed to maim and kill targets through toxic exposure. And that started in 1917, was when we really started focusing on the manufacture of these weapons with the intent to use them in warfare situations. And we kept manufacturing them through the 1960s. And we manufactured a lot of them, literally tons and metric tons, thousands of tons of these agents. And once we started doing that, we realized, okay, we've got to put these somewhere. We have, when they're not in use, we have to put them all somewhere in, safe locations. And so we developed 8 depots in the U.S. mainland, and then one on Johnson Atoll, which is an unoccupied island in the Central Pacific. You may have heard about that in the news. And so we sort of had them spread out all over the U.S. In terms of where we were putting these, where we were storing them. However, in 1980, the United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons in Geneva happened, and they basically issued a mandate that restricted the use of certain weapons, which were considered excessively injurious or whose effects were indiscriminate, right? So this idea that we can't just spray things everywhere on everybody, and have them, travel through the air and affect who knows, right? So civilians, children, women, vulnerable communities, we really don't have a lot of control over these things, and they have very, very serious consequences. So in 1986, the United States followed suit. They passed a mandate that basically said we had to destroy all of the lethal chemical warfare agents that we had in the United States. So all of these depots, these 9 depots, we had to go in, figure out what was in there, and destroy it. Okay. And so these are the storage locations, right? So like I said, Johnson Atoll, there was Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, Newport Chemical Depot in Indiana, Pine Bluff Arsenal in Arkansas, Anniston Army Depot in Alabama, Umatilla Chemical Depot in Oregon, Deseret Chemical Depot in Utah, which was later renamed Tooele, and that will come up in a little bit here. The Pueblo Chemical Depot in Colorado, and Bluegrass Army Depot in Kentucky. So you may or may not have been aware. Some of you may have lived sort of near these places or visited these places, have family living near these places, may or may not be aware that that's what those were, right? Because it doesn't necessarily, especially the ones that say Army Depot, to most people, they don't understand that we're, literally storing chemical weapons in these places. And so the question became at the time in the 1980s, once they said, okay, Congress says we have to destroy everything, we're not going to use this in warfare. The question for the military became how, right? How do we go in and destroy these very dangerous, very potent, very lethal substances that we have all over the United States? And that really was the impetus for a broader conversation. Like I said, today we're going to get into, some of the details of this case. We're not going to go into all 8 of the Continental Depot locations, but we are going to talk about 2 of them and sort of the conversation that happened around the destruction of these chemical weapons. So essentially what happened then in the 1990s was the Army announced their plans. They were going to incinerate these weapons. And I have here on the slide in the 1960s and I believe 70s, there were some instances where the Army was literally taking these weapons out into just outside and putting them in pits and burning them. And as you would imagine, that's a very, very bad, dangerous idea, right? And so it was decided that they had to develop a technology and then the infrastructure to support that technology in order to incinerate these weapons. Okay. And so the incineration process basically looks like I have laid out here. So they plan to use very high temperatures to break down these liquid weapons with the intention of making them no longer harmful, right? So no longer an issue if you become exposed to it. And so their idea and their process associated with incineration started with basically taking the munition apart and doing that robotically, and then draining the chemical agent from the munition. The metal itself was burned at a very high temperature for at least 15 minutes. And the idea there was to make the metal also not dangerous or lethal. And then burning the liquid at 2000 degrees. And then so basically rendering everything what's the word I'm looking for? Rendering it just, so it's not, it is not no longer poses a danger to humans or animals or the environment. And then they would take the metal away and recycle that, and they would send the materials that were associated with the liquid burning to a storage facility. Right. Okay. So the Army basically said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this at all 9 depots. Right. And Johnson Atoll, there was less concern around that one because there was nobody living there. But they said, so all 8 Continental depots, we are going to incinerate these weapons, and we have a timeline, and we need to build incinerators in order to do this. Okay. So as you'd imagine, this was concerning, and this was concerning specifically. It was a broad issue, but there were a lot of concern generated at the local level. So people who were living in, surrounding these depots, and they were, basically you have this facility and you have neighborhoods all around these facilities. And there was a big pushback on the Army plans to incinerate. And so this came from the public, this came from residents, but there was also political pushback, which we're not going to get into too much today because there's just not enough time to get into all the ins and outs of this very complex story that spans 40 years. But there was a lot of concern that the incineration was going to be dangerous. And so the public wanted to push for an alternative destruction method instead of incineration. And specifically what they wanted to push for was an alternative technology for the destruction of chemical weapons called neutralization. Okay. So unlike burning the weapons, this this process basically had a neutralizing technology that would eliminate the need for any sort of anything being released in the air, right? So same idea, the munitions are disassembled, right? The nerve agent's drained and separated from the explosive components. But then instead of burning it, you use hot water and sodium hydroxide to destroy it. Then once that happens, the actual material is tested to make sure the chemical agent is destroyed. And then again, the remaining material shipped to a hazardous waste treatment, storage and disposal facility, or safely recycled. Now, I should mention that both of these technologies at the time were fairly new, right? And so that's like thinking back to that question, how do we destroy all these weapons? We made all these weapons with the intention of storing them and keeping them, not with the intention of destroying them, and especially destroying them on such a large scale basis. And so both of these technologies were sort of being proposed. The Army was really adamant about incineration, and people who were very concerned about that were more proponents for neutralization. So how many sites would you guess actually went with neutralization? I'm sort of giving away the end of the story here, but how many sites would you guess? You can put in the chat or Mike. So we've got 8 of these sites that are in the continental United States. How many of those do you think went with neutralization when the Army wanted to do incineration? Got some stuff in the chat. All right, Madison guessed 1. Anybody else have a guess? Alex guessed none. Okay, that's a good guess. That is a good guess. So actually what happened was it was 4. So 4 of the sites decided to do neutralization instead of incineration, which is pretty wild, right? So like I said, the Army was very adamant about this. And those guesses are very good guesses, right? It's not often that the public can sway military agendas, especially around these technologies, these highly risky, highly technical issues. And so that's weird, right? And I say a lot of times when I'm trying to explain sociology to people, and I may have said this in the introduction to the seminar, but sociology, a lot of it is just like, that's weird. Looking at what people are doing or social phenomena and saying, that's weird. Why did that happen? How did that happen, right? And so they did incinerate at 4, Anniston, Pine Bluff, Tooele, and Umatilla. But they, at Aberdeen, Bluegrass, Newport, and Pueblo, they chose the neutralization technology instead. And so, like I said, this is weird. And it really kind of was like, okay, now once we realized that, it's like, how was the public able to sway military institutional forces, which are, historically very difficult to persuade away from their ideas? How did they do that in a debate over a highly technical and at times secretive decision, right? And so the military isn't also known for sharing tons and tons of information with the public about everything. And so what kind of happened here? So like I said, this was a collaborative effort. So I worked with the Environmental Justice and Health Working Group, which is a collaboration between North Carolina State University and the University of Florida. That working group has since kind of disbanded, although we're still working on the actual papers and analysis and things like that are associated with this project. But we sort of came together as a group because the amount of information and the amount of data and just history associated with this particular project was pretty vast, right? I mean, if you would imagine, we've got all 8 sites, we've got 40 years of debate over this, the technology used for the destruction of chemical weapons. And so we came together as a collaborative group to kind of attack this, in pieces, basically. So our research questions so we had a number of research questions. And so we're going to focus in on this particular one for this presentation today, which is, how did the U.S. Army and environmental activists engage in this discursive competition regarding disposal technologies, right? How were they talking about this? How were they sort of fighting against each other, advocating for their preferred technology? How did that kind of occur over time? And more broadly, the question is, just in general, how do environmental activists engage in discussions about risk in cases where the military maintains a distinct power advantage and control over both environmental risk management and environmental decision making, right? So we know that there is, if you just have a group of folks who don't like what the military is doing, that doesn't necessarily mean the military is going to listen. So how can environmental activists engage in these discussions with the military, where the military has sole responsibility about what actually ends up happening? All right, so to look at these two cases that I'm going to be talking about today, which we'll get to in just a second, we looked at, so there's a big body of literature regarding risk framing and a big body of literature regarding risk governance. And those are sort of the frameworks that we used for shaping how we approached data collection and data analysis. And the reason that risk framing is really important is that we know that it can shape policy, it can shape technological outcomes, it can shape impacts on local communities. The way people talk about risk is really important. And so if you think about, how people talk about risk in terms of climate change, okay, we have a major hurricane headed our way right now, and we just dealt with one. And so how do people talk about the risks associated with hurricanes, right? Is it important to evacuate? If you evacuate, where do you go? If you don't evacuate, how do you prepare your home? How do you keep your family members and loved ones and pets safe, and yourself, obviously? And so that kind of communication is really, really important. It has real life impacts, right? If you're not communicating correctly with timely recommendations or mandates to evacuate from a hurricane, obviously that has real life implications. So risk framing is really important. It really does shape outcomes both positively and negatively. And in these cases specifically, we're talking about technological risk. And so the other reason risk framing is really important is there is a lot of uncertainty that is associated with evaluating risk. Okay, so think about this like from a personal standpoint. When you go to the grocery store and you're trying to evaluate what maybe is safe to eat, right? So we kind of balance affordability and safety. So maybe you go for more organic foods or non-GMO foods, or coffee that's grown in a particular location or way, or something that may be supporting environmental outcomes that you want, right? But we don't necessarily have all of the information that we need. So there's often a lot of uncertainty involved in evaluating risk. And so the whole discussion about genetically modified organisms, foods, that is a big discussion where you've got two sides, basically one side saying no, this is safe, and other side saying we don't know it's safe, or we have evidence that it's not safe, or we have evidence that GMOs are linked to cancer, or what have you. And so it all just becomes this ambiguous thing where it's like, I don't know. And so in risk framing, even though there is uncertainty, different sides can kind of communicate their concerns and communicate their desired outcomes in specific ways. And we know that power is embedded in how risk is interpreted, right? So in this particular case, obviously, that we have the United States military, very powerful institutional force, and we have local grassroots groups of just concerned citizens, relatively powerless in comparison. And so that power is embedded in how risk is interpreted, how it's communicated, and how it's perceived among different groups, right? Different target groups. And so we're going to be talking about the term technical adversarialism, which was a term coined, I believe, in 2006. And it was specifically coined to describe this military public interaction in debates around risk. So specifically, it is described as decision-making styles based on overtly or implicitly on the assumption that technical issues should be left in the hands of experts and authorities whose task it is to educate the public, as long as it brings perceptions into line with expert opinion. Okay, so technical adversarialism isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does sort of exclude different interpretations, opposing interpretations, or anything that doesn't really line up with what is defined as scientific expertise or technological expertise. And that's like a super, this is all brief overview, because this is, like I said, this is huge, as a super brief overview of the frameworks that we were using, but those are sort of like the key takeaways. So for what we're talking about today, so like I said, this is part of a much bigger project that we've been working on. But what we're looking at today, we did a lot of document analysis to try and kind of figure out like who was saying what was going on, and what the history was, and how this developed over time. So for the two cases that we're going to look at today, which is Tooele and Pueblo, and if you remember, so Tooele did incinerate, they didn't end up incinerating, and Pueblo didn't. They ended up going with neutralization. So we looked at 623 news articles that were specifically talking about the debate over destruction technology. And so those were published between 1984 and 2022. And we also collected a lot of government documents, archival materials, lawsuits, freedom of information requests, and any other secondary archival material that we could get that could kind of help us put together what happened. So this included documents from the U.S. Army Chemical Materials Agency, news releases from agencies and officials at each storage depot, environmental reports by the EPA, the Army, and government agencies, and then legal complaints filed by attorneys representing concerned residents. So very quickly, so we used both qualitative and quantitative methods for analysis here, but we did code each artifact for analytical themes. And specifically for this particular case, or this particular part of the project, we were focused on the public debate about chemical weapons demilitarization and officials' decision-making around disposal technologies. And so we used a specific coding strategy that led to an iterative line-by-line coding process, which identified analytic categories that we knew we were looking for, as well as things that were in the data that we didn't know we were going to encounter. So this included scientific contestation of risk claims, official and activist framings of risk, expert knowledge in interpreting risk, contested risks of incineration, neutralization, and weapons storage, and contested knowledge around weapons disposal. So we're going to start with talking about Tooele. So Tooele Army Depot is located in Tooele County in Utah, and that is located about 40 miles southwest of Salt Lake City, if you know where that is. And it is surrounded by a lot of arid desert, so it's not a very populated area. There are people there, but it's not like a tight urban spot. And so Tooele was actually established in 1942 because the Army wanted and this was way before they were thinking about destroying the weapons, but they wanted a place where they could test and store the weapons, right? And so they started with the Dugway Proving Ground in southern Tooele County, and that's where they were testing both chemical and biological weapons. And then the Army Depot, which at the time, like I said, was called Deseret Chemical Depot, they were using that for mostly for storage and maintenance of the chemical weapons. And Tooele actually stored the majority of the chemical weapons that we had in the United States. So in 1991, there was a reporter that described it as the largest cache of chemical warfare munitions in the free world, which it was. However, Tooele, like many of the storage locations, was sort of characterized by this history of problems with the storage of chemical weapons. So there was leaks, there were accidents, there were environmental problems that happened at this particular site. Most famously in 1968, the Dugway Proving Ground released a lot of that venomous Agent X into the open air. It led to a sheep kill. I have over here, it's over 6,000, I think it was like 6,400 sheep died as a result of exposure to VX. And so surrounding all of these events, these environmental problems, the Army kept pretty tight-lipped. They did not take responsibility for the sheep kill at the time. And they promoted what was called, sort of in the literature, a quote unquote information haze, by failing to facilitate any sort of straightforward communication with the public, right? So there was no information provided, there were no reports about these incidents, there were no alerts or any sort any sort of forewarning for communities to protect themselves. And so in 1993, it was found that the residents may have experienced health effects due to low-level VX exposure. But over time, we know that Tooele County residents did report serious and chronic illness symptoms, including headaches, trouble breathing, and flu-like symptoms. And that was a pattern in that area. So like I said, so the Army, so like kind of like fast forwarding a little bit into the 90s, the Army developed these incineration technologies for chemical weapons elimination and became, again, committed to baseline incineration. However, between 1983 and 1987, there were 8 different accidents at the facility, and they were building a prototype incinerator to deal with these, deal with the destruction of these weapons. And the prototype incinerator had an incident that released nerve gas into the air at levels 73 times higher than the legal limit. So as you'd imagine, okay, so then sort of more information was coming out, and there was some, information that was getting through the media. And so going into newspapers, people were reading about the newspapers and becoming very concerned, right? As I'm sure you would be if you lived in the area and you knew that there was a release of VX gas in not just one incident, but 8. And it killed 6,400 sheep. And, these incidents really started to garner a lot of concern from people in the area. So as a result, we saw like a lot of organizing. So the National Toxics Campaign Fund became involved, as well as the Utah chapter of the Sierra Club. But locally, there was the Downwinders and Families Against Incineration Risk. And the Chemical Weapons Working Group, which is going to come up again, got involved. So they actually were a grassroots group that emerged around the Bluegrass Army Depot, which is in Richmond, Kentucky. But they sort of became involved in this issue more nationally, and they started going to these different sites and trying to basically raise awareness about the concerns associated with incineration and get public support and political support for neutralization technologies as an alternative. And so there started to be sort of this back and forth between these, involved and concerned groups and the military and representatives from the military. And a lot of this actually did play out in the media. A lot of this was covered in the media coverage at the time. So the opposition concerns, right? So these people were concerned that in their communities, they were burning these lethal weapons, in the process of both storing and trying to destroy them. There were these leaks and potential exposures. And so they were basically concerned that the emissions from incinerator stacks could contain trace amounts of toxic agents, could harm the workers that were working in these facilities, could harm residents if they got outside of the facility. And there was a lot of, again, this uncertainty. There was uncertainty of the health implications of incinerating chemical weapons because we had not done that on a very large scale before. And so many of the residents were like, hey, we don't know. We don't have faith, right, that this is a safe technology, that we are not at risk. And so they were concerned about, the quote, possible long-term health impacts of incomplete combustion and byproducts of the combustion process. And so that was sort of what they were saying, and they were saying that in the media. They were trying to get attention. They were trying to sort of garner support for their campaigns by talking about all of these things, basically saying, we're afraid that this can hurt us and that this is not an appropriately or efficiently developed technology to use at such a large scale. So going back to that term, technical adversarialism, right? So the Army was saying, no, like it's fine. They were basically saying the incineration is fundamentally safe. You can trust us. We know what we're doing. We have the technology. We have the experts. We have the science behind this, and this is going to be okay. And so there's a quote here from a military representative, an Army representative, saying toxic chemical munitions are dangerous, but because of the elaborate safety precautions we take, the plant is a very safe place to be. We know what we're doing is a very sophisticated operation. And so essentially the Army used expert knowledge to validate claims about incineration safety. So there was a lot of that. And we see a lot of that in cases of environmental disputes over environmental hazards and threats, right? That oftentimes, the military, the government, corporations, whoever is the target of the grievance, they will rely on expert knowledge and say, hey, we've got the expert knowledge, we have the science. So an example here, the incineration process has been studied and endorsed by the Centers for Disease Control and the National Academy of Sciences. We're going to do this in an extremely safe manner. We are doing this with a prime concern being the safety of the workers, the environment, and the community, right? So really trying to assuage concerns. We know what we're doing here, and there's no reason to be concerned about incineration. However, the other side claimed that the Army ignored science on the risk of cumulative exposures. Okay, so they were saying, okay, well, the relative risk of exposure to one thing is, but not the relative risk of, that cumulative impact of multiple exposures at the same time. So for example, a recent study shows synergistic effects of dioxins, PCBs, and other dangerous chemicals. That means if chemicals are released together, the effect is 100 to 1,000 times worse than if exposure occurs separately. And a new body of literature about hormonal disruption shows that extraordinarily low doses of dioxins can cause damage to developing fetuses. And so you'll note that came from 1996. We know a lot more about that now. But it was sort of this idea, you can't say for sure what is going to come out in those emissions or be a byproduct of the incineration. And so that it could be way worse than you're claiming, and you're sort of undercutting our concerns. So one of the big interesting things about this case is the immediacy of the risk, right? And so essentially the Army was saying, I gotta speed this up a little bit here. But essentially the Army was saying, if we leave these weapons in storage while we're developing the technology and infrastructure to support the technology for neutralization as opposed to incineration, we can incinerate now. We have that. We have incinerators installed. We have these prototypes, and we're good to go. If we wait, there's a possibility that the chemicals could do things like self-ignite. They call these maximum credible events, right? Like, what if there's a flood? What if there's an earthquake? What if there's a terrorist attack? What if they just self-ignite? And you can see there's a picture here of Pueblo. They had these in these little, what they called these storage igloos, and that's where they were keeping the weapons. And so what if they start leaking, right? We know that they're deteriorating. Some of these are, really, really old at this point. Like I said, this production started in 1917. So the Army was saying, like, if we just leave them in there, we have a higher chance that something catastrophic could happen versus if we incinerate it now. And we're still saying that incineration is it's safe. The activists countered that by saying they were intentionally inflating the risks of ignition. They filed lawsuits, specifically in 1996. There was a big lawsuit trying to compel the Army to switch over to neutralization. And they were saying, like, look, you're fear mongering essentially, right? You're trying to make everybody scared that these chemical weapons are just lying all around, so you can basically proceed with your agenda to incinerate them. There was also uncertainty about neutralization. There was a lot of discussion about this because, like I said, these were two new emerging technologies where we didn't know, kind of what we were doing. And the idea was that neutralization was safer, but that wasn't totally established. And so, a representative from the Army said those new neutralization technologies have never been fully tested on chemical agents. Do we want to continue to store an unwanted stockpile of chemical weapons and wait, or do we want to get rid of it now using a demonstrated safe and effective technology? And so while the activists tried to match the urgency of the Army's framing, they were really fairly unsuccessful, right? So we know that Tooele went ahead with the incineration. They were unable to stop them at that point. So there was uncertainty about the risks associated with incineration. They couldn't say for sure. They said maybe something will be in the missions, but we don't know. Lack of publicly available information at that time. And then, like I said, this dispute about the risks associated with incineration versus long-term storage. So let's switch over to Pueblo Chemical Depot. Okay, so this is a depot that did end up using neutralization technology, and it was actually the depot that okay, I'll get to that in a second. Okay, so anyway, so they switched to neutralization. So Pueblo was established in 1942 as well during World War II. It also was located in a semi-arid desert about 100 miles southeast of Denver. Pueblo had less of the nerve agents like VX, and they were mostly had like the mustard gases, the mustard derived agents, and they had those 95 concrete storage igloos, which you saw in the previous picture. And again, the Army did officially announce that they were going to use incineration at Pueblo as well. However, what was different in this case was the activists were actually able to shift away from emphasizing these long-term health risks that they were concerned about. What if we all have cancer in 20 years? What if there's, long-term reproductive, effects for women, or we don't know what's happening with incineration. They were able to point to Tooele and say, okay, Tooele had a lot of problems. They had leaks, they had these environmental issues, they had the sheep kill, they had these different types of issues, and so that increased availability, solid information that they were able to point to. Really kind of validated their claims and concerns, right? And so they call that the lifting of the information haze, right? So more information became available, especially around the problems associated with Tooele. And it was described as like being a sponge run out, agent is leaking out of the whole facility. And so once they were able to do that, they were able to say, okay, we're not talking about long-term concerns anymore. Now we're talking about imminent and catastrophic problems associated with incineration. And so in 1996, and what was key here was a whistleblower came forward regarding Tooele and came out in the news and said that the Army failed to tell the public that the release of nerve gas VX could kill residents, that they were claiming that they were a safe facility and they were following all recommended procedures and regulations, but in reality, the whistleblower said that that was not true. The Army knows that they have a 40-mile kill zone. They've done nothing to defend the communities in any credible way at all. And by pointing to the failures at Tooele, they were able to get much more support for their push for neutralization at Pueblo. So at Tooele, the facility shut down 30 times in 3 years. There were more than 16 identified leaks, including sarin gas. There were 9 civic groups that emerged in Pueblo to oppose incineration. At that point, they were able to get a lot more support. And they engaged in a 7-year battle for neutralization. And so ultimately they were successful, like I said. They had some political support. So the county commission, the city council, and 2 chambers of commerce united and pushed the Colorado Senate for neutralization, which in turn asked the Pentagon to implement neutralization in Pueblo. And the Pentagon announced its decision to use neutralization to destroy Pueblo's stockpile. And so the sort of case of Pueblo was described in the paper by a journalist. Pueblo's story is important in the chemical weapons debate because when the issue of disposal was first raised in 1994, the discussion was heavily focused on building an incinerator at the Pueblo depot. Opponents of incineration worked hard over the next 7 years to change the discussion from incineration to a water-based neutralization method. And as of July 7th of last year, all of the chemical weapons in the United States have been destroyed. And you can see here how many. And so Deseret, which is also known as Tooele, there's over 13,000 tons of this chemical weapon, these types of chemical weapons destroyed. In Pueblo, it was just under 3,000 tons. So what does this story tell us? So like I said, we know risk frames have real consequences, right? And so what is different in this case was it was a case where the public was able to change what the military was doing in terms of a highly technological process. And so this shows us a little bit more about the public and military entities in terms of these environmental hazard conflicts. We know that power is a particularly salient factor, but it can be overcome, right, in a variety of different ways if citizens unite together. It's also very interesting, military secrecy is a very necessary thing, right, for national security. But that does give the public a lot less information about what kinds of environmental hazards are in their communities and what is going on. And what was interesting in this case is that a lot of times when you see these environmental conflicts play out, you see, concerned citizens amplifying the risks, right? Saying, we are really concerned about this. We don't want it in our community. We don't want this to be happening, or whatever their grievance happens to be. And the target of their grievance, corporation, government, military, whatever, often just saying, no, 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 there's no risk. There's no reason to be concerned. Often relying on that expert, technical adversarialism. In this case, they were both saying, yes, there are risks, but the Army was saying the risk is storage, and the public and political opponents were saying the risk is associated with incineration instead of neutralization. And so that's kind of a different dynamic than we normally see play out. And so they both framed their positions as the one that most minimized risk, although they fundamentally differed on how to do that, right? And so having that additional information about the problems associated with the Tooele facility, lifting that information haze was instrumental in the push for neutralization. And the incorporation of the technical failures at Tooele were led them to be able to successfully push for neutralization at the Pueblo Chemical Depot. So we are, like I said, this is a small part of a much broader project that we are working on as a result of, sort of all the data collection and analysis we've been doing over the past 3 years. And specifically looking into the role of political opponents and allies. Like I said, I didn't really get into that today, but that was a very big part. And some surprising political opponents to incineration technology emerged. Mitch McConnell being one, surrounding the Bluegrass Army Depot. He was a big proponent for neutralization. And so, sort of how those political support mechanisms play out in determining whether the public is successful in their campaign. Having discursive opportunities to engage in these discussions with the military. That's not always the case. Aberdeen is a really good example of that, which we did not talk about today, but Aberdeen is in Maryland, and they have a Superfund site, and but because of national security, will not release or did not release any information to the public about where the Superfund site was specifically on their property and what the contaminant was. And so that, again, like that information haze of not having information to properly evaluate the risk that you are facing in your community because of national security poses a particular issue. The grassroots mobilization, like I said, the chemical weapons working group in Kentucky, sort of developed at that local level, but became a national and persistent group. There's still a group that tackle these types of usually issues with military and environmental risk. And this sort of taps into, what I find very interesting is how people engage in debates over highly technical issues, right? Especially issues where we're relying on people to gatekeep information for us. And so, the idea that like Allison, the environmental sociologist, cannot walk into a nuclear plant and evaluate whether it's being run properly or not, right? I have no idea. I have to rely on experts and people with expertise, scientific expertise, engineering expertise, these kinds of, backgrounds to evaluate that risk for me. And that can be nerve-wracking for people, especially when they feel like they're at risk for something happening, or, a risk to their health or a risk to the environment in their communities. And that really also taps into this whole trust in science. When do we trust scientific claims? When do we not trust scientific claims, whether it's about climate change or vaccine safety or the safety of GMOs or whatever it is? There's a lot of like these highly technical debates where, the government or other entities ask people to trust them, right? And so how does that play out at just among the lay public? All very interesting avenues of research, I think. So that brings me to the end of this discussion, and I appreciate you all listening. And I'm happy to take any questions, or like I said, if you don't have questions and you want to contact me separately about any of this or any of the other things that I'm working on, I'm more than happy to do that. That one in the chat. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, if nobody has questions, that's totally fine. Like I said, thank you very much for letting me present on that. It's something I kind of is like a passion project, and I feel like it's really interesting. It's really fascinating. I've learned quite a lot. And so at any rate, I hope you all stay safe during the storm. I hope you are all able to prepare for it. It seems, I keep looking at the radar and it's like all over the place. It's like moving south and then north and who knows. If anybody has any concerns or needs help connecting with resources, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you all on Monday, and thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. I'll see you later.
Unmuted. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.